Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, welcome back in. I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on the Cover 3 podcast network. And today, we're going to talk a little Vanderbilt Commodores, who were a lot more feisty last year than I thought they were going to be. And to do so, we're going to have Robbie Weinstein come on. Vandy 24/7 does a great job. If you want any kind of Vanderbilt news, that's the spot to go to. Robbie, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bud. And yeah, Vandy was more feisty than I expected last season, too. I mean, I thought that they were going to be less just absolutely terrible than they were in Clark Lee's first season, but I did not expect 5 wins.
5-7. And, you know, you could quibble like were they a game lucky or not relative to the power ratings, but they were a top 80 power rated team for the first time in 4 or 5 years. That's a legitimate, pretty solid season for a building Vandy team. I know that's not their ultimate goal. That's not where they want to go, but had to be pretty fun actually covering these guys.
Well, certainly late in the season. I mean, I think early on there was some ugly football in a number of these games. But toward the end, I mean, it sort of came out of nowhere, to be honest with you. They almost beat Mizzou, and kind of the way that game went down at the end with a questionable call on 4th and 1, on a drive where they could have won the game. It felt like maybe things were going to fall apart for them, and instead they came back and were able to win at Kentucky in sort of a miraculous fashion. They needed a 4th and 20 to win that one, and then the Florida game really came out of nowhere because they legitimately went and won that one and kind of controlled it from the beginning. The yardage at the end of the game really flattered Florida, but most of that came after Vandy was up big. So they improved throughout the season. And, I mean, honestly, during spring ball, it looked like that, upward trend continued.
Absolutely. So let's start with the offense here. Last year, 56th in the power rating. In a down-to-down basis, there were certainly struggles, and that was early and late, but they did something that I'm not entirely sure is repeatable for any team just relative to what the rest of the offense rated. Man, they hit 3rd and long completions and converted 3rd and longs at a ridiculous rate, and that really helped them to win those 5 ball games. They do lose Mike Wright at quarterback, but A.J. Swan played a lot last year, and I think was sort of the dude that they wanted to go with ultimately, and was better in SEC play. I think Wright had some, quite a bit of success against the early season schedule. Where do you see Swan taking a big jump this year if he can?
Yeah, I think, he didn't get, like, toward the end of the season, he was dealing with some injuries. He had at least 1 concussion. And so I think sort of where you'll see him maybe take a step forward is he had, like, really good chemistry with Will Shepherd, but I think sometimes he would lock in a little bit too much on Shepherd, and that certainly became apparent in the Missouri game, which was one of Swan's worst games of the season. I think he'll probably get better at kind of commanding the offense, being a leader, and spreading the ball around a little bit more. I think it's possible that you see him throw a good amount of picks this season. I think he only had 2 last year, and he is kind of a gunslinger who at times will put the ball at risk and should have had more interceptions than he ended up having last season. But, I mean, you look at the arm talent, like, that's not the type of guy that Vandy has had, certainly in the last 10 years. I think you probably would have to go back to Jay Cutler just in terms of his ability to push the ball down the field. Kyle Shermer was a really good player, but that was more like intelligence rather than true arm talent. So he definitely, I mean, he gives Vanderbilt like a downfield passing dimension that it hasn't had in a while. And I mean, maybe it says a little bit more about the SEC overall, the quarterback situation, than about Vanderbilt. But I mean, there's a decent chance that he ends up in the top half of the league's starting quarterbacks this season. That's kind of stunning, considering he's only a true sophomore.
Absolutely. So at the running back position, they do lose Ray Davis, who I thought was a really good back. Kentucky thought so too, and he ends up transferring to the Wildcats. But they've recruited this position fairly well, it looks like. I know you had some guys kind of flash in the spring. Who's the dude, if there is one, who's going to step up and take the lion's share of those carries?
My guess would be Cedric Alexander, who's a true freshman, and they call him Baby Ray. He's got some similarities, very similar build, and I think a similar running style as well. Ray Davis, as you said, very good player. He wasn't a burner, but he I think had good vision. He was a good cutter and, good pass protector. Could also catch the ball out of the backfield really well. And Cedric Alexander brings most of those same traits. He's a 3-star true freshman out of Austin, Texas. And, if you lined him up and had him run the 40, he's not going to blow you away. But Vandy has a zone blocking scheme, and they're not really looking to hit home runs in the run game. They're more looking to keep the defense honest and keep the chains moving. I think he can do that. He really came on strong late in the spring and ended up probably being their best running back by the end there. They've got 2 more true freshmen coming in Diego Benson and AJ Newberry. It's hard to say exactly what to expect from those guys. So this is going to be probably a by committee approach. I don't think anybody is going to be, getting 20 carries a game like Davis was at times last season. It's definitely the weakest position on the offense for them, probably, I would say. But I also don't know that they need to have star power there, considering they've got a pretty good wide receiver core and it appears a good quarterback, and they've got a lot of starts returning on the offensive line too.
I'm glad you mentioned the receiver position. They returned basically everybody who caught a pass. Shepard, McGowan, Skinner are all back. Am I right to assume those guys are your starters, or do you think maybe there's a chance that like some young guy steps up and usurps one of them?
I think those are the starters, and they're pretty good starters. Like Quincy Skinner in particular, he looked really good during fall camp last season, and then in the very first game against Hawaii, he tweaked his hamstring pretty badly toward the end of the game, and just didn't do anything then for probably the first half of the season. Started doing some stuff late. He had a really good spring. I mean, he and Will Shepard look like SEC wide receivers. They're not going to run a 4, certainly maybe even a 4.5 in the 40, but they're big and physical and athletic. Jaden McGowan runs a 4.35, so he gives them the speed aspect of things. But they do have some depth there too. Gamarian Carter is I think redshirt sophomore who did some things late last season. He took an 80-yard hitch to the house against Mizzou. And Junior Sherrill is a true freshman coming in who I think is going to play as a backup slot behind McGowan. He played for Lipscomb Academy and was their best player. Trent Dilfer was coaching that team, and that was one of the best high school teams in the country last season. So to be the best player on that team definitely means a lot. I think they've got a very legitimate SEC caliber wide receiver core, honestly. And, we'll see how the pass protection is, but like they can hurt you, in that aspect of the game. I don't know how well the run game is going to complement that. But this is looking like a pretty decent group, especially because Shepard, I think, is going to be drafted next season. Maybe not even day 2, but I mean, I think he could be like a 4th-round pick or something.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that pass protection. The offensive line did improve some last year, which was really helpful to the improvement of the offense. And you returned everybody with the exception of the left tackle. I would assume kind of mild to moderate improvement here, or do we think there's room for a big jump?
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting group because they've got like over 70 starts returning, but I don't know that the talent level really is that good. I think they got absolutely as much as they could have out of that group last season, and credit them. Like coming into the year, I thought that was a huge weakness, and they didn't even end up being the worst offensive line in the SEC. I think that probably would have been Kentucky.
Yeah.
Having said that, have these guys maxed out? A lot of these guys are Derek Mason recruits. They're big, but maybe not the most athletic and not the quickest. It's not really the type of player that Clark Lee's staff has looked to recruit to Vanderbilt. They look for lighter offensive linemen who can move and play in that zone scheme and develop over time as they add weight. So I kind of wonder if maybe they're going to take a slight step back, to be honest. Vandy did a lot of work last season to try to protect that offensive line with, having tight ends blocking and, also running backs helping them out. And, if you take the training wheels off, are they going to be able to protect the passer as well as they did last season? I'm not sure that they can. Like, for instance, Gunnar Hansen, so they actually lost the right tackle, but Gunnar Hansen is returning at left tackle. I think he could be an NFL player as a guard, but I'm not really sure about, high-level left tackle in the SEC. I think he's serviceable, but I wonder about their ability to really hold up on the edge against really good SEC edge defenders. I think they can be fine in the run game, but I would be a little bit surprised. Like, I think they just kind of are what they are at this point. I would be surprised if they take a significant step forward, when they've already got 70-something starts under their belt. I'm just not sure there's that much for them to improve until they get the younger guys in there.
Sure. I mean, that speaks to the coaching that they're able to hide them some and maximize the talent.
Yeah.
I guess, and it's weird to say this given that it's an SEC schedule, but like Wake Forest, of the teams on the schedule, like Wake Forest lost a lot of pass rush. I think Kentucky still has good. Missouri lost an important pass rusher. Florida's probably better on the interior than they are the edge. Georgia, okay, Georgia's Georgia. Ole Miss, spoiler, when we do their summer school, their edge play is a major concern. Auburn is not great on the edge. South Carolina lost a ton on the edge rush, and Tennessee, like defensive line, was not their school's strength last year. So I guess if there's a saving grace that in playing an SEC schedule, like I don't see LSU, I don't see A&M, right? Like there are some teams that it could be more problematic to play if you have an offensive line that is not a great pass protection thing. So they may be fortunate there.
They had Alabama on the schedule last season, and they had no chance against Will Anderson, but they don't have to play him this season.
Exactly right. So let's talk about the defense here. Little rougher. 94th nationally. Run defense was very competitive, both in conference and out of conference. Pass defense, I mean, thank God for Kansas, right? Otherwise, they would have been the worst. And I guess Colorado's a different level, but that's just that almost doesn't count. They blitzed, unlike Kansas, who was terrible on pass defense too. They blitzed a ton, but they were 128th in pressure rate, despite sending quite a few blitzes, which is probably says something about personnel if you're willing to do it and you still can't get home. Up front, off a run front that was fairly good at stopping the run, they do lose 800 snaps from the defensive line. Is that a unit we think can hold serve, or maybe can it step up? Is there any way they were to drop off there?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot different from the offensive line in that they are bringing back a decent amount of guys on the D line, but a lot of them are young and I think have a lot of upside actually.
Okay.
And you saw in the spring, defensive line kind of got the better of the O line in the spring and was very competitive, getting a lot of disruption. Clark Lee said that to him that was the most improved unit, pretty easily on the entire team. And so Darren Agu, for instance, is a rising true sophomore who was kind of like, I think maybe he was a 4-star recruit in the composite, but we had him as a 3-star. So borderline 3-star, 4-star guy, 6'6", 250.
We were low on a Barton guy? Oh, man.
Yeah, it is a Barton guy. Yeah, I mean,
where's the love for a Barton guy?
Yeah. So he started to play, like he got into games last fall and didn't do anything, but he started to really flash in the spring. And Miles Capers, their best pass rusher by far last fall during fall camp, he went down with a really serious knee injury at the end of fall camp, and so they just didn't have him, and there's no pass rush. So as you said, that's exactly what it was. They had to bring the inside linebackers and maybe slot corners and such, and they still couldn't get pressure. So that is a recipe for disaster in terms of pass defense. I think they can get, I don't think they're going to be a good pass rush by any means this season, but if you go from one of the, probably the worst in the Power 5 to just bad, I think that can make a big difference, to be honest with you.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the interior of the defensive line, I think, looks pretty good. They've got some depth. For the first time, you can actually go across the defensive line, and I don't know if there's a star there, but you can say, okay, you got 2 deep here, 2 deep here, 2 deep here, and they can actually rotate some guys in and out and have some success. So, I mean, I think it's baby steps for Vanderbilt at this point, but when you're starting to, finally have some quality depth as, to go along with competent starters, that's when you do start looking at bowl game as a potential.
James and Clifton are certainly not bad building blocks if you get some of those young guys to kind of glow up, and that's huge, man. Linebacker looks like it suffered a lot of attrition. It was a decent linebacker unit at times last year. Is there a young guy who's going to step up to kind of make sure this thing doesn't drop off, or how is the Stanford transfer look to Cosmo?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. Aeneas DeCosmo was the only transfer they brought in the winter window, which is kind of crazy, if you compare it to the rest of the SEC. I mean, Vandy just doesn't really want to build through the portal for a number of reasons. Last season for Stanford, talking to Jackson Moore, who covers Stanford for us, he was saying that DeCosmo did better last year as a traditional defensive end. But Vandy is going to play him as a stand-up kind of, 3-4 hybrid outside linebacker, defensive end, edge rusher type of guy. And I was a little bit pleasantly surprised in the spring. I thought, he's not, I wouldn't say he's an above average starter, but I think he's okay. Like he's passable, and if he plays 35 snaps a game because they can rotate multiple guys into that position, I think he can be very passable. Against kind of the mid to lower tier SEC teams, which is who if you're Vanderbilt, that's who you're trying to beat. You're not trying to you're a long way away from beating Georgia and Tennessee, and you got to focus on beating Kentucky and Mizzou and those types. So he was solid, I thought, in the spring. Losing Anthony Orji at inside linebacker, that's a ton of production out the door. Kane Patterson, the former transfer from Clemson, is going to start, and he was decent last season, I would say. I am expecting them to get Prince Colley from Notre Dame. I have a crystal ball in for him. He's visiting this week as we sit here on May 11th, and I think he's going to end up on the team and probably start and be a nice boost for them. Then Bryce Cowan is a redshirt freshman who is incredibly talented. He's the most talented linebacker that Vanderbilt has had since Zach Cunningham. I don't think he's going to end up being that good, but he was a standout in the spring game. Really long, 6'4" guy who can run. Needs to keep putting weight on, but he's interesting. And then CJ Taylor is a hybrid outside linebacker safety who PFF really liked. I think they had him second team All SEC. He had a couple of great plays against Mizzou in that game last season. Like he hurdled a running back to pick up a fumble for a touchdown against Mizzou. So I think if they get Colley, I think they could be pretty good at linebacker. That was a pretty big question coming into the spring, but that would really go a long way, I think, to shore up their depth there, especially because he's a guy that Clark Lee is very familiar with. He recruited him to Notre Dame, and he fits the system really well.
Is Colley a guy that Clark would have recruited when he was at Notre Dame? Trying to think.
Yeah. That's the connection. They're at least they were really tight. I don't know how much they talk at this point, but Lee was his primary recruiter, and if Vandy gets him, that's going to be why.
That's typically what we've seen is if you go get a player off your former roster, he may not end up being a stud, but I feel like the bust rate for those type of players is relatively low because you've coached the guy before. He's not a total knucklehead, hopefully, if you're bringing him in a second time, right? And at least he can play at that level. Robbie, got to ask you about the secondary here. So they returned 3 of their top 4, at least by snap count. The numbers last year weren't great, but as you noted, they blitzed all the time and never got home. So you're asking guys to play a lot of sort of difficult blitz coverage at times. Are we thinking that it's still right, Mahoney and Taylor? Taylor's numbers actually were kind of impressive at times. Are there young guys here that are ready to step up?
Yeah, there better be, or else they're going to be brutal again, I think. So at safety, they've got veteran safeties, Jalen Mahoney and DeRicky Wright. Wright is pretty limited speed-wise for a safety, but he's 6'4", and is a good tackler. I mean, he had 2 or 3 picks last season. He's a pretty solid player.
Is he really 230? He's listed 6'4", 230?
Yeah,
that's
he's
crazy
big
for a safety. Wow.
Yeah, he's huge. He's huge. At corner is really the concern. I think they can go too deep at safety and be okay. Corner, they lost by far their top corner, Jadis Richard, to the transfer portal. He ended up transferring to Miami earlier this week. This was a spring loss, and to replace him, they brought in an interesting guy, Nazir Forkurian, who was a Division II All-American at Grand Valley State. So, I mean, you tell me, does that translate? I don't think we know until we see him, play against these guys, these SEC players in practice and on the field. So he could start maybe at boundary corner, at the field spot. They've got a bunch of guys, including redshirt freshman Quantavis Gaskins and Trudell Berry, who was a 4-star recruit in the 2022 class. Somebody along those lines is going to need to step up because the true freshman didn't really play a lot other than Richard at corner last season. I mean, these are players who are very talented. Whether they're ready yet, I would lean no, but they certainly could surprise me. And at least, if nothing else, I do think they're going to have a lot better support up front in terms of the pass rush, which was, I think they had 6 sacks or something crazy last year. It was really miserable.
Yeah, they and obviously Barton, my former podcast co-host. So they were actually almost equally bad at getting pressure and then at converting the pressure they did get into sacks. So if there's any improvement there, the defense will skyrocket from the 90s to, heck, if you get to the 70s in defense and you stay 50s or maybe high 40s in offense, that's a legitimate team that could compete for a bowl if they're able to do so. A couple more for you. I really appreciate the time talking today. So last year or 2021, their special teams were horrendous across the board. I mean, their kickoff was garbage. Their punt coverage was terrible, and I think a lot of that was just they didn't have enough competitive depth that was athletic enough to actually cover kicks within the SEC. They fixed a good bit of that last year. Like they went from bottom 10 in kickoff coverage to bottom 50, which is an improvement. Their punt coverage ended up being really darn good. Their return teams were elite. Field goal kicking was still bad. I mean, bottom 10 in field goal points efficiency. They lose Bulovas, which I use the term lose kind of loosely, but for a team that if they're going to get to a bowl game, they're probably not going to do it in blowout fashion, right? Like they're going to have to win some close games. They've got to find a way to kick better. Are they going to bring in a kicker, or is the Will Forrest or Ferris kid any better? Or
their kicker situation that's the worst. I mean, that's the worst situation of any position group on a team. Will Ferris, has a big leg. He's a preferred walk-on, and like last year during fall camp, he nailed like a 55-yarder in a scrimmage with room to spare. But he is pretty inaccurate, pretty inconsistent. I mean, he's a young player and he's a preferred walk-on. So they've got Brock Taylor, who is a relatively highly rated true freshman if you look at the specialist rating sites. But he's a true freshman, so who knows? I think they're going to add probably another preferred walk-on, like maybe an Ivy League transfer type of guy. That's usually what they like to do. So it's totally up in there. I mean, I think it's fair to say that kicker is going to be a major weakness for them. At the same time, I do think you could see further improvement in every other area of special teams because, the big difference was just that the way that their current coaching staff recruits, they're trying to bring in athletes. They're trying to bring in guys who are fast and really improve the team speed. And even if those guys aren't ready to play on offense or defense as true freshmen, they can contribute on special teams. And you saw a big difference there. Matt Hayball, the punter, who's formerly transferred from FAU, is also one of the best punters in the country.
It really is. All right, Robbie, I'll get you out of here on this one. I really appreciate the time previewing Vanderbilt. Where is the biggest drop-off, not including quarterback, of course, between the starters and the backups at a position group?
That's an interesting one.
Like we've all covered a beat where it's like, oh man, if they lose guys at this position, these backups just really are not ready to play.
I think tight end would be one. They are really thin at tight end. So they had Kamorian Pimpton committed for 6 months or so last cycle. And he started as a 3-star recruit, ended up, in the top 100 or so and flipped to LSU last second. And as a result, they're up against the 85. They don't really run guys off. And so they're going to have 4 or 5 scholarship tight ends for this season. And 2 of them are going to be true freshmen. So, I think Cole Spence, who's a redshirt freshman for them, has a lot of talent and can do some stuff as a receiver. I don't blocking wise. I think he still has a little bit of ways to go. And then Justin Ball, who might be a starter, he's really, really injury prone. So, I mean, they could lose a couple guys there and just not have any tight ends, which would be an issue because last season they utilized 2 tight ends a lot on offense. That's what I would point to. One of the reasons why I think Vanderbilt, is a pretty safe bet to be a decent team this season is that they've got really good depth at quarterback. Ken Seals is the backup. Yeah. He was the starter 3 years ago. This is unheard of at Vandy. So, that I think is one of the big keys to their turnaround is that, tight end and maybe corner would be answers to the question you're asking. But outside of those 2 positions, I think they can lose starters and sort of survive, which is, certainly has never been the case over the last 4 years or so, basically since the last time they went to a bowl game, which was in 2018.
Robbie Weinstein, Vandy 24/7. Really appreciate you joining us here on Summer School.
Yeah, thanks for having me, bud.